All right, kids, it's the moment you've all been waiting for where we actually classify what evolution is. Now, we all probably know that Charles Darwin, is who we associate with evolution. So here he is, great big bushy beard. He lived from 1809 to 1882. But what you may not know is that Darwin actually wasn't the first person to suggest that organisms change over time. That's basically what evolution is organisms or life changes over time. And so we'll look at some of the people who kind of influenced him as we go along. Um, just a little bit about Darwin. The information that really led him to this idea of evolution by natural selection, he got from his study on the HMS Beagle. He was hired as the naturalist on His Majesty's ship, the Beagle. This was in the 1830s, I believe. They sailed, here you can trace their journey around to South America, several stops in South America, including one of the most important ones just off the coast of South America, the Galapagos. They went over to New Zealand and Australia, up into the Indian Ocean, hit Cape Town, Africa, back over to South America, and then up. And this isn't everywhere they stopped. These are just some of their major ones. This trip took somewhere around 5 years to complete. It was way longer than it was supposed to take, mainly because Darwin was a very, very uh, nitpicky note taker. I mean, he was very, very detailed in what he did. He had volumes upon volumes of notes and hundreds and thousands of specimens that he brought back with him, which he spent about the next 20 years or so poring over and studying as he did, his other research, and before he finally compiled and published The Origin of Species by Natural Selection. So a few observations that Darwin made about species while he was on his journey. There are three of them, which we're going to talk about really quickly. If you look at these, what are these? Obviously, they're camels. They're a little bit different though. This one, has kind of this mohawk going on here. His It looks like he has a lot more fur, thicker fur on him than this one over here does. Obviously, this one has two humps, whereas this one only has one hump, contrary to popular myth. The hump is not just filled with water. It's actually mainly, fat and connective tissue and things like that that does store some water, but it's not like there's just an empty tank of water in here. So the difference between these two is, this is a camel that we typically find in, in the Saharan region of Africa. Think like Egyptian camels, whereas this one is what we know as the Bactrim camel, which is found in Mongolia. So these two species of camel, though they're very, very similar, live in very different parts of the world. Mongolia is a colder desert, whereas northern Africa is a very, very hot, dry desert. Well, all deserts are dry, but it's much hotter. So they're found on two different continents. And that led Darwin to, it wasn't camels, but he noticed with species that species vary globally. Meaning you can find similar species across the globe, but a species here, even though it might have a counterpart here, are going to be different because of the environment that they live in. These are both tortoises, Galapagos tortoises. You'll notice that this one has a kind of a low shell here over its neck, whereas this one has a much, much taller kind of a hump here right above its neck. And so I want you to think about how that might or impact, what they're able to eat. Okay, this tortoise, lives on an island of the Galapagos where there's a lot of vegetation, just growing down here on the ground. And so he doesn't need to be able to strain his neck up high, whereas this one, you can see in the background, there's lots of, brush and bushes and things. There's not a lot of grass on the ground. He has to be able to crane his neck up high to reach things. And so over millions of years, as these guys have been on the different islands of the Galapagos, the food source that's available has selected for, especially this one, this really big dome above its neck. Within a population, maybe they all started out looking like this. And, each one has a slightly different curvature on its shell. And over time, the ones that had just a little bit more curve were the ones that could, survive and reproduce and pass on those genes. And over time, they became more arched like this. So the vegetation that's available is what drove evolution to make this tortoise have a much higher arch here above its neck so that it could reach up high. Um, if we look here, these are only separated by a few hundred miles, fairly close to each other. And so Darwin's second observation is species vary locally. Local changes in the environment or ecosystem can affect the species that have evolved there. So here, Isabella Island is, there's a lot of lush grassland here along the coast, whereas Espanola Island, it's a lot rockier. There's a lot more brush, or what you might expect of like a chaparral type ecosystem, like in California or the Mediterranean. And then finally, and this one's kind of, a little bit more extreme, but if we look here, um, obviously this is, a dinosaur. I believe it's a velociraptor, and this is a pheasant. Pheasants are extant. Velociraptors are extinct. So why would I put these together? Well, if you look at them, they have similar body structures. They both have a really long tail. It's going to help them keep their balance while they're running. Their bodies are positioned forward over their front legs. They have hind legs. They have very powerful hind legs for running, and they have reduced front appendages. A pheasant has wings, but a pheasant's not a great flyer. They can pop up and glide a ways, but they rely more on their running. Same thing with the velociraptor. They run very, very quickly using these powerful hind legs. They can even jump very well. Um, but they're obviously different species. But you can see this body plan here has been preserved over time, and so that's what the last observation is, that species vary over time. This dinosaur lived during the late Cretaceous period, whereas uh, uh, we've got sorry. We've got the pheasant who's been living here during the late Neogene, um, you know, current time. So there's a lot of time between these two, but this body plan has been preserved, which suggests they share some kind of an ancestry, because everything about us is determined by our DNA, which codes for proteins, which makes us who we are. And so, why would this one have the same body plan if it didn't share some of the DNA that this species has? All right, we talked about there are some people who influenced Darwin, so we'll talk about them really quickly. One was James Hutton. He was a geologist, and basically he said the Earth is really old. Well, how old? If you remember from another lecture, it's about 4.6 billion years. That's a really, really long time, and that's important because evolution happens slowly. Another geologist was Charles Lyell, and he kind of gave Darwin this idea of uniformitarianism. If you look at this word uniformity is right here. That means everything's the same. Well, what Lyell basically said was, when we look at rocks, mountains are formed by, when two continental plates kind of run into each other. So you've got a plate here and a plate here, and if they run into each other, it's going to cause buckling, which they kind of buckle up. Now, that's a terrible drawing, but you get mountains that rise up there where they meet. Um, and so, that's how mountains form. Well, how do mountains, disappear? Well, the rain comes down and, erosion takes it away. That happens now. We can see it happening. And he said, the same processes happened in the past. And this extends to other areas too, like in biology, the way that we do DNA replication, or the way that we inherit our traits from our parents. It was the same in the past as it is now. That's really important because, if we, especially looking at rock layers, if the way that sediments were laid down and fossils were preserved changed in the past, that might alter our view of how evolution actually happened. We wouldn't have as much to go on. But since we can look at the processes now, we can see them happening. Um, and we know that they must be the same in the past, that gives us a lot more evidence and support for the idea of how old the Earth is, how old fossils are, because we can look at the processes that made them. We also had Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. Now, this is kind of a little bit silly here, but your daddy acquired it, you inherit it. Well, that's wrong. What Lamarck said was that evolution proceeded by what we call acquired traits. So you know what the word acquired means. Um, his example was a giraffe. So the original short-necked ancestor of the giraffe. And now we have the modern long-necked giraffe. Well, there has to be a mechanism to get us from short necks to long necks. And we can see these guys in the fossil record. So how did we get to here? Lamarck said, Well, giraffes, they reach for the plants that are way up high. And so, over years of their life, they strain their neck and their neck gets longer so they can reach them. Well, then the tree has to escape, so they get taller. And so then the next generation, they strain their neck. And so they're constantly stretching their neck to reach up here to get these leaves. And so over time, by stretching their neck, he said that the neck of these species become longer because then, they stretch their neck and then they're going to pass that on to their offspring. That's an acquired trait. They gained that through their life, from the time they were born to the time they die, they were stretching their neck. And so then when they reproduce, they pass on that stretched neck. Think about that. Does that make any sense? Let's pretend that we've got a little guy here and he has an unfortunate accident and he loses an arm. So there's his arm on the ground. If he reproduces, is he going to have a baby who only has one arm? No. Okay. When you acquire something in your life, it's not in your DNA. And since DNA is what gets passed on from parent to offspring, if I chop off my arm, my child is not going to be born without an arm. Okay, acquired traits do not work. Therefore, Lamarck, a little bit of a dunce there. Now, he did notice that things change over time, which, is what evolution is, but the mechanism that he suggested is wrong. And that brings us to Thomas Malthus. Malthus, again, this isn't very eloquent here the way I wrote it, but we're all going to starve. He was an economist, and so he studied, the economy and human populations, and he noticed that human population. So if we draw a little graph here, human populations were going up faster than the amount of food was going up. So here's food, and then here's our population. And so what he said was, we're going to reach a time where there's not enough resources, and people are going to have to be fighting for resources. It's going to lead to anarchy, and it's basically people are going to be fighting each other for resources, and only the strongest will survive. This kind of idea of social Darwinism, if you will. Well, all of this kind of led Darwin to come to the following conclusions about evolution. One, the Earth is very old. We've mentioned that several times. That has to be true for evolution to work. Biological processes in the past happen as they do now. That's that idea of uniformitarianism. Some members of a population are different. Duh. If you look around the room, like if you're sitting in a classroom, there's obvious variation among people in your population. And some of these differences are heritable. Now, things like pierced ears, no, you're not born with pierced ears. Or missing an arm because you lost it in an accident, you're not born with that. Those are acquired traits. But some traits, some of these differences are actually inherited, which means they have to be coded for in our genes or our DNA. Oops. Um, Small changes accumulate over time, so thousands of generations or more. So, if in a population you've got some people who are slightly taller than the others, and that gives them some advantage, they'll likely reproduce and pass that on. So gradually, if always the taller people are surviving, then your population would expect to go up in height. And these changes are very small. People think that we go from a short-necked giraffe one generation to the next generation, all of a sudden they have huge necks. That's not how it works. It is a small, gradual process over thousands of generations or more. That's why, the Earth has to be so old. Um, More offspring are produced and can survive. Everybody's always like, oh, that's sad. Not all the panda bears are going to survive. Well, if there was no pressure, if there was nothing that said, hey, this is a good gene and that's a bad gene, evolution wouldn't happen. If we didn't have to compete to survive, then there'd be no reason for a species to evolve. There'd be no mechanism to drive that. So this is kind of an obvious statement that more offspring have to be produced and survive. The weaker ones that are born that don't have what it takes, they die off, and with them, those negative or weak traits. And then so survival of the offspring is not random. This seems kind of cruel, but the earth or the world is kind of a cruel place. If you don't have what it takes, you'll die. Now, in humans, we do lots of things to compensate for that. Oops. For example, if you're born with a heart defect, we've got ways of fixing that because of technology. But think about, a tiger that's born with a heart defect. It's probably not going to be able to hunt well and get the resources it needs, and it'll probably die. And so, when it dies, it takes that gene or that trait with it. So if it doesn't reproduce, it doesn't pass it on. So we should see non-desirable traits disappear and desirable traits become more common because what's required to survive in any given ecosystem is not random. Okay, it is not a random process that putting a penguin in the Sahara Desert, it will die. It doesn't have what it takes. All right, so some more of Darwin's proof. If we look at the finches that he studied in the Galapagos, we'll show this one first. He noticed that the finches looked fairly similar in terms of body structure, except for their beaks. So here, we've got tree finches over here. They obviously live in trees. Ground finches live on the ground. And then we've got what kind of bills they had, and then what they eat. Seed eaters, really broad um, beaks that could be used for crushing up seeds. Think about if you were to eat a whole bunch of nuts. Would you chew them with your front teeth or your back teeth? Obviously your back teeth because they're big and wide and strong and you can crunch things up. So these guys have really strong, powerful um, uh, posterior portions of their beaks. Um, the insect eaters, they need really sharp beaks. It may not look like a huge difference here, but if you look at them from the side, they're much sharper and pointier, so they can get into those insects and tear the flesh out. Think about it, if you were to bite into a steak, not using a fork, but just pick up a steak and bite into it, you'd use your front teeth because they're much sharper to rip that meat up. And then you got things like parrot-like bills that eat fruit. They have to be able to shovel things out of the fruit. So they have kind of a scoop-like shaped um, bill that enables them to take out big chunks of whatever fruit they're eating. Um, and so each of these is an adaptation. The different beaks are an adaptation, and that's any inherited. That's key. Remember Lamarck? It's not acquired. Any inherited characteristic that increases the organism's chance of survival. Okay, if all you have to eat is seeds and you have a really sharp beak like this, you're not going to make it. If you have to eat fruit and you have, a beak like this that you can't scoop much fruit at, you're not going to be very efficient at eating, and it's just not going to work out for you. And so what we noticed, or what Darwin noticed, was, we had this original species from South America that came over and landed in the Galapagos Islands. So this would be our founder species. As they moved around to the different islands, there's different resources here. So maybe here there's seeds and here there's insects. Well, over time, the selective pressures of what there is to eat is going to change their beaks. And so this becomes a different species. When it comes back here, like if it flew back to this island, it's not the same anymore. They're not going to reproduce. They're separate species. And so this process happened all over the Galapagos so that we ended up with all these different kinds of beaks and all these different kinds of finches because what was needed to survive in each environment was different. And so over time, the ones that were best suited for their environment adapted to that and they evolved into new species. So why do organisms adapt? Well, because they're struggling for existence. Take the polar bear, for example. Their habitat is disappearing. They're very well adapted to hunting on the ice for hunting seals. As the ice is disappearing, they're going to either have to adapt to hunting on land or they're going to face extinction. Now, the problem is, our climate is changing very, very rapidly. And so, as global temperatures are going up, that's undisputable. The evidence is there that our average temperature is going up and our ice caps are disappearing. These guys have to figure something out. The only problem is that evolution usually happens over a longer period of time. And so um, this could be, like the asteroid impact that killed the dinosaurs, melting of the polar ice caps. In terms of geologic time, very, very quickly this is happening. That could be the catastrophic event which these guys cannot adapt to fast enough. But everything is struggling for existence, and that's why they have to adapt. One key thing is this mama polar bear, she can't adapt. Okay, it's not at an individual level. It's the entire species, the entire population has to adapt um, because we look at changes in their gene pool or the allele frequencies. So let's look at a ridiculous example here. We've got 4 squirrels and only 1 nut. Not enough resources. They're going to be competing with each other because just like polar bears, polar bears they have to compete for resources on the ice. So they have to compete for each other. So this is how they do it. Again, I said this was ridiculous. So if they're fighting with lightsabers here, the one who's got the best lightsaber skills is probably the one who's going to survive, right? Or the one that's going to win the battle and get the nuts to be able to survive. But let's pretend that we've got this guy. Look how big his lightsaber is. he's probably going to be able to just at least intimidate these guys, and he'll win every fight. So he's more likely to get the nuts because he has what we call a better adaptation here. He's more adapted to sword fighting because look at the size of his lightsaber. Now, obviously, this is a stretch because we said that an adaptation is inherited. First, lightsabers aren't real. Second, they're not coded for in DNA of squirrels. But let's just pretend that they were. We would say that this guy with the big, huge lightsaber has a higher level of fitness, whereas the ones with, not as good of adaptations, lower level of fitness. And fitness refers to the ability of the organism to survive long enough to reproduce. That's ultimately what all organisms are concerned with is reproduction. Even humans. I mean, we have social constructs that and morals and goals in life and everything like that that our life isn't just about reproducing. But when you go through puberty, why is it that our hormones are raging and it's wanting us to reproduce? It's because it's coded for in our DNA. It's our natural basal instincts to preserve our species and reproduce. Um, but so if these guys are going to reproduce, and along comes little Miss Lady Squirrel, she has to be picky about who she mates with. It's a huge investment for females to reproduce. So she's not going to want to pick these guys who, aren't as well adapted, aren't as fit, aren't going to be as healthy probably because they can't win as many battles and get as many nuts. But whereas this guy, he kicks everybody's butt. He gets all the acorns. He's going to be strong and healthy. She sees that and says, I want my offspring to be strong and healthy. So the next generation, he's going to pass on his traits to them. These guys either won't reproduce or won't reproduce very much. And so you can see over time, if this is what makes it so that you survive and are healthy enough to reproduce, that's what gets passed on. Again, ridiculous example, but it makes the point. So if we look here again, Lamarck's giraffe, remember stretching the neck is what evolved it. Darwin's explanation here, and this is the better explanation, says that within a population of giraffes, you've got some that are naturally just a little bit taller than the others. If that helps them get more food, great. They'll be healthier, more likely to reproduce. The ones that aren't as tall, can't get as much food, they die before they reproduce. I know, it seems kind of sad, but that's the way the world works. And so the next generation, is going to be the progeny of, or the offspring of the ones that have the best traits. And to amplify this out over millions of generations, you can see how you can go from being a short-necked giraffe to a very long-necked giraffe. Again, these changes are very, very gradual. Okay, because even if this guy, the tall giraffes are the ones that reproduce, you're still going to have a lot of them that are average height or about the same height as the parent. But you might have a few that are just slightly taller. And if that gives them a little advantage, they'll reproduce more and they'll be able to pass on those genes. And so over time, the better gene, the better phenotype becomes more pronounced. More evidence, the fossil record, things like woolly mammoths, we can see those in the fossil record, trilobites, fish from the Devonian period, dinosaurs. We can see that life changes over time. And how does that happen? Well, it happens by natural selection, which is the driving force for evolution. The ones that have the best traits survive. Some catastrophic event comes along and you're not able to survive it because you don't have the right traits, well, you die. More evidence. If we look at the upper appendage of several of these mammals here, we've got human, horse, cat, bat, bird, whale, humerus, 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 humerus. They all have the same bone in their upper appendage. Radius and ulna. Here in the horse, they're fused, and in the bat, they're fused, but in the others, we still see radius and ulna. Then we've got, our carpal bones. And then we've got our metacarpals and phalanges. They're all there, but you can see how they've been modified a little bit. Sorry, I said mammals. Bird's not a mammal. They've been modified a little bit, but they're the same structures. Okay, they're the same parts. They've just been modified to meet the needs of the organism as it's evolved. A whale needs just a few long fingers to support its flipper. It doesn't really need a long arm. That's why its humerus, radius, and ulna are really short. Horse doesn't need fingers, so they all fused, and so he has just the one hoof. A cat, they have their fingers. It helps them grasping things. A bat has these really long fingers, which then have the webbing between them, which makes this into a wing for them, so they can fly. Bird, they don't really need fingers. They just need some support out to the end of their wing. The same structures. They've just evolved differently um, to suit the needs of the persons they belong to. Let me get rid of these marks really quickly. So if we, compare this to when we were studying cladograms, you can see how, some ancient species, probably a lobefin fish, developed these bones to help them move on to land. Well, then depending on, what niches they occupied, you might evolve into an amphibian or a frog or a mammal. And you've got things like the alligators, the reptiles, and the birds. They've modified these parts to meet their individual needs. Um, but because they all have those same parts, they had to have shared a common ancestor. Think about in your family tree. You and your cousin might have the same, distinguishing characteristic of your family. Well, you have it because you shared your ancestors. We can see this in things like skulls. Here you have the Homo sapiens, that's us. And then, Neanderthals, the cavemen, they went extinct about, 40, 50,000 years ago. And we actually think the reason why is because Homo sapiens killed them. I mean, we would be competing for the same resources. Homo sapiens are smarter, even if Neanderthals are slightly, stronger and hulkier. We killed them off because they were competing for the same resources. Um, that's all the evidence we found suggests that. But we look very similar. Well, that's because we had to have shared some common ancestry. So, we go back in time, we can see our ancestors. So there's Homo sapiens Mauritanicus. Uh, some of them moved over to Eurasia, and some of them stayed in Africa, and so they evolved differently. Um, and that's why we have Homo sapiens and Neanderthals. And we can trace this back a long ways here, all the way back to things like Australopithecus. Um, you can see how the skull structures as we go back, I mean, are changing as we go back. They're also changing as we go forward. But the reason why they're so similar is because we had to have shared this common ancestry. So even things like chimpanzees, yes, they have a longer snout, sharper teeth, bigger mandible for stronger jaws, but the bones are all there, like in Homo sapiens. So we had to have shared some common ancestor in the past, and we can, trace this back a long ways to some of our earliest fossils. Um, Also things we've got like vestigial structures. These are things that are left over. They evolved because they helped our ancestors in the past, but we really don't use them anymore. Like wisdom teeth, we didn't used to have tooth care. Um, Australopithecus didn't know how to brush his teeth, and so teeth would fall out as they'd rot. Well, if you didn't have teeth to replace them, you'd starve because you couldn't eat your food as well. Wisdom teeth come in about 20 years old, so they help, extend your life. Now we take such good care of our teeth that really wisdom teeth end up screwing up our teeth. They're vestigial, they're leftover, they're remnants, something that's not really used anymore. Same thing with like the coccyx. It's the remnants of the tail that our ancestors would have had. Body hair, huge mammalian trait that helps keep us warm. We have clothes. So over time, being really hairy wasn't an advantage, and so it's kind of disappeared. There's lots of things like tonsils, not really used much anymore. Ear muscles, cats use their ear muscles. We don't. We don't really have a need to. So these are structures or traits that are left over from our evolutionary history. Our ancestors needed them, but because we've evolved more, they're they're still there. They're on their way out. We don't need them anymore. So, we would expect over time they might disappear entirely, at least in the adult form. And then embryology, that's the study of, embryos in development. If we look at these two, chicken, human, they look almost identical. If we look at another one here, which one's the human? Right here. Fish, salamander, turtle, chicken, rabbit, and human look almost identical in the early stages of embryological development. How could they be exactly the same? Why would they be exactly the same unless they shared some DNA? Unless they had a common ancestor. Think about where you get your DNA from. You get it from your parents. They get it from their parents and their ancestors all the way back. We must have shared a common ancestors to have the same DNA so that we would end up looking the same as we're developing. As we move on, the fish and the salamander look different from us much sooner than the turtle, chicken, rabbit, and human. Well, that's because we're more closely related to a turtle, chicken, rabbit, and human. And if we go on, salmon and fish look very similar. Turtle and chicken look very similar. Rabbit and human look very similar because we're both mammals. So you can kind of see as we go through our stages of development as an embryo, you can actually kind of watch the changes in our evolution happen because we look very similar to a lot of other organisms early on. But then as we go further, as we get closer to being born, you only see our closest relatives look similar. It's really hard to look at this and say that there's any reason for why they would look so similar other than they share DNA, because remember, DNA determines all of our traits. It determines what's going on during development. And why would we have the same DNA unless we shared an ancestor? And we're not going to talk about Hox genes. So that's pretty much it. There's a lot of evidence I just presented to you really quickly, but that's the majority of what you need to be familiar with in terms of evolution.